The air in the small apartment was thick with the scent of cardboard and a future that did not include her. 8-year-old Sophia sat on the floor, the worn rug a tiny island in a sea of half-packed boxes. Her father, Richard, moved around her like a storm, a whirlwind of frantic energy and muted despair. He wasn't just packing clothes, he was packing away a life, the one they had shared with her mother. Sophia's small hand clutched a single crayon, its waxy tip tracing a family on a scrap of paper. A smiling mother, a tall father, and a little girl holding both their hands. She didn't understand the blueprints spread across the table or the urgent phone calls, but she understood the silence that had grown between them since the funeral, a silence as vast and cold as the empty side of her father's bed. She approached him timidly, a silent offering in her outstretched hand. The drawing. It depicted the two of them standing beside a giant, fantastical building that reached the clouds. It was her attempt to enter his world, to show him she understood his dream. Richard glanced down, his eyes barely registering the image. His face, etched with exhaustion and a grief too heavy to carry, hardened. For him, the drawing wasn't a gift. It was a reminder of everything he was trying to escape, the responsibility, the emotional weight. The little girl who looked so much like her mother. He saw not her love, but an anchor. He saw a chain holding him to a past he had to outrun. Have you ever tried to give someone your whole heart, only for them to not even see it? You'll just be in the way, Sophia. The words weren't shouted. They were worse. They were spoken with a chilling, practical finality, a simple statement of fact that sliced through the air and embedded itself in her soul. The crayon slipped from her fingers, rolling under a box. The vibrant colors of her drawing seemed to fade before her eyes. The world, once a place of imaginative wonder, suddenly shrank to the size of that single, devastating sentence. Her father's voice, the one that used to read her bedtime stories, had become the voice that judged her very existence as a burden. It was the moment she learned that love could be conditional, that she was an obstacle to be moved aside. He zipped his suitcase. The sound was violent, a tearing sound that severed the last thread connecting them. There was no hug, no "I'll be back," no final look of affection. He simply handed her small suitcase to her grandmother, Helen, a woman whose hands were as calloused and unyielding as her expression. Sophia watched her father's back as he walked out the door, a silhouette shrinking against the harsh hallway light until he was gone. She was left standing in the doorway of a new, strange life, the crumpled drawing still clutched in her hand. It was no longer a picture of a dream. It was the wreckage of her childhood, a fragile piece of paper that held all the weight of his rejection. Left alone in the sterile silence of her grandmother's apartment, a place that smelled of mothballs and unspoken rules, Sophia looked down at her own hands. What was wrong with them? What was wrong with her? The echo of his words, "in the way," began to build the walls of a prison inside her mind. She was a problem to be solved, a piece that didn't fit, a burden. That night, she didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It settled in her chest, a cold, heavy stone of worthlessness. She had lost her mother to fate, but she had just lost her father to a choice. He had chosen a dream over her. She only wanted to be loved. Was that too much to ask? Richard did not look back. He drove with the windows down, letting the cold city air whip against his face, a futile attempt to numb the silence that now occupied the passenger seat. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, a grip of forced conviction. He told himself it was the right choice. The only choice. The blueprints for the overseas project were spread across the seat where Sophia should have been, crisp paper promises of a new life built from steel and glass. He saw skyscrapers, not the small crayon-drawn building his daughter had offered him. He was an architect of futures, he reasoned, and sometimes foundations had to be laid on difficult ground. But a small, nagging voice whispered from the back of his mind, a voice that sounded unnervingly like his late wife's. Was this strength? Or was it the most profound act of cowardice? Before the silence, there was laughter. Richard had once been a man who saw wonder in his daughter's messy drawings. He and his wife, as Clara, had plastered them on the fridge, calling Sophia their resident artist. Clara was the one who balanced his soaring ambition with gentle reality. She was his compass, his anchor. When the accident took her, it took more than his wife. It took the architecture of his own soul. The grief was a demolition ball, leaving him standing in the rubble of his life. He looked at Sophia and saw not his child, but a living, breathing ghost of Clara. Her eyes, her sensitivity, her quiet way of observing the world, the love he felt for his daughter became tangled with the unbearable pain of his loss, a knot he didn't know how to undo. His depression wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, creeping fog that muted all the colors of his world. He went to work, paid bills, and made Sophia dinner, but he was a ghost in his own home. Her needs felt like a constant, high-pitched frequency he couldn't tune out. Her questions, her need for a hug, her silent offerings of artwork, they were reminders of an emotional landscape he could no longer navigate. He saw her sensitivity not as a gift, but as a fragility he couldn't afford to protect. In his brokenness, he began to believe a terrible lie, that her softness was a weakness, an obstacle to the brutal strength he needed to survive. Have you ever felt so broken that you started breaking everything around you, just to feel in control? Then came the project. It wasn't just a job, it was an escape hatch, a massive, career-defining contract in a country halfway across the world. It promised money, prestige, and most importantly, distance. It was a chance to outrun the ghost in his apartment, to build something so grand it might silence the grief in his head. He constructed a careful narrative for himself. He was doing it for Sophia's future. He would build this empire and then send for her, giving her a life Clara would have wanted. This self-deception became his gospel, a necessary fiction that allowed him to look in the mirror. He convinced himself that leaving her was not an act of abandonment, but an act of provision, a temporary sacrifice for a permanent reward. The pressure mounted, bills piled up. The mortgage was overdue, and the project had a non-negotiable start date. Sophia, with her quiet needs and her crayon drawings, became the final, impossible variable in his desperate equation for survival. The day he packed his bags, every nerve was frayed. Her drawing, offered with such innocent love, was the final straw. It felt like an accusation, a demand for an emotional connection he no longer had the capacity to give. The words, "You'll just be in the way," were not born of malice, but of a complete and utter emotional bankruptcy. They were the last few coins rattling in the pocket of a man who had already lost everything of value. It was the moment his grief became a weapon, and his daughter the unintended target. On the plain, as the city shrank below him into a grid of distant lights, Richard felt a chilling wave of something he refused to name. It wasn't freedom, it was emptiness. He had cut the cord, amputated the last living piece of his old life, believing it was the only way to move forward. He had chosen the blueprint over the hand that drew it. He was flying toward his dream, but the cost was a part of his own humanity, left behind in a sterile apartment with a grandmother who didn't understand art. The abandonment had shattered an 8-year-old girl's world, but it had also hollowed him out from the inside, creating a void that no skyscraper could ever hope to fill. Would you have made a different choice in his place? Her grandmother's apartment was a world of muted greys and browns, a place where dust motes danced in the slivers of light that fought their way through grimy windows. It smelled of boiled cabbage and the bitter scent of mothballs, a stark contrast to the memory of cinnamon and fresh paint that lingered from her old life. Sophia learned the geography of this new world quickly, the creaky floorboard to avoid, the chipped teacup that was hers, the threadbare armchair she was not to sit in. She was a ghost in this house, a small, silent shape, moving through rooms that held no warmth for her. Her existence was functional, provided for but never celebrated. She had a bed but not a home. Helen, her grandmother, was a woman carved from hardship. Her love, if it existed, was buried deep beneath layers of pragmatism and a weary resilience. She communicated in chores and clipped commands, her hands, chapped and strong, always busy mending, scrubbing, or counting pennies at the kitchen table. One afternoon, Sophia timidly offered her a drawing of a bird, its wings outstretched in hopeful flight. Helen glanced at it for a second before turning back to her mending. "Foolishness," she grunted, not unkindly, but with a finality that felt like a slammed door. "There's no time for scribbling. It's a waste of good paper." The words didn't cut like her father's had. They simply confirmed the verdict. She was a waste. So, Sophia's art went underground. It became a creature of the night, a secret ritual performed in the hushed hours after her grandmother's heavy snores filled the small apartment. By the faint glow of a street lamp, she would pull out her treasures, The smooth back of an old electric bill, a discarded grocery receipt, a flattened cigarette carton found on the street, a pencil, worn down to a tiny stub, became a key unlocking a world only she could see. She drew the face of the mother she was starting to forget, the shadow of a man walking away, and gardens filled with impossible, vibrant flowers. This was not a hobby. It was how she breathed. Have you ever had a secret world that was your only salvation? School was not an escape. It was just a larger, louder version of her loneliness. The playground was a chaotic sea of laughter and shouting that she could never bring herself to enter. She was an island, a fixed point of silence that the other children swirled around. They called her Ghost Girl because of her pale face and the way she'd flinch if anyone spoke to her directly. At lunch, she would find the most secluded corner of the schoolyard, unwrapping her sandwich with meticulous care, making the simple meal last as long as possible. She ate with her back against a cold brick wall, a silent sentinel watching a life she wasn't part of. Her isolation was a fortress she built to protect herself, but it was also her prison. The neglect was a physical presence, a constant companion. It was in the thin, scratchy blanket on her bed that never seemed to hold off the winter's deep chill, leaving her to curl into a tight ball for warmth. It was in the dull, repetitive meals of soup and stale bread, food that filled her stomach but never her soul. Her clothes, mostly hand-me-downs from a church donation box, were a constant reminder of her otherness. A sweater with sleeves too long, a pair of shoes that pinched her toes. Each item was a piece of a life that wasn't hers. Another signal that she didn't belong. Could you have gotten a single night's sleep in that cold, lonely bed? In the quiet moments, her father's voice would return, an echo that played on a loop in her mind. You'll just be in the way. The words had become the foundation of her identity. She would spend hours staring at the one photograph she'd managed to keep, a faded image of her mother and father smiling, with her held between them. She would trace her mother's face with a trembling finger, trying to recall the sound of her laugh, the feel of her hand. But the memory was becoming translucent, fading with each passing day, leaving only the sharp, indelible memory of her father's back as he walked away. The photo wasn't a comfort. It was a relic from a buried civilization where she had once been wanted. She learned to want for nothing. Her silence became her armor. If her shoes were too tight, she walked with a limp she tried to hide. If she felt a cold coming on, she stifled her coughs. If a question burned in her mind during class, she swallowed it. Sophia learned that needs were dangerous. Needs made you a burden. Needs were the reason she was here and not with him. So she amputated them one by one until she was a model of quiet compliance, a child who asked for nothing and therefore could not be a nuisance. Have you ever felt you had to erase parts of yourself just to be allowed to stay? Hope, when it did appear, was a fragile and fleeting thing. Once, she found a small, injured sparrow in the alley behind the apartment. She smuggled it inside, making a nest for it in a shoebox and feeding it crumbs of bread with a pair of tweezers. For 3 days, the tiny, fluttering heartbeat in the box was her entire world. It was a secret friend, something small and broken that she could care for, but her grandmother found it. We can't afford pests, Helen declared, and despite Sophia's silent, pleading tears, she took the box outside. Sophia never saw the sparrow again. The world had taught her another lesson. Anything she chose to love would be taken away. Holidays were the cruelest times. The city would light up with festive colors, and the air would fill with the sounds of celebration. But inside the grey apartment, nothing changed. On Christmas morning, she would receive a practical gift, like a pair of thick wool socks, placed on her pillow without a card or a smile. Her birthday would pass unmarked, just another Tuesday. She would watch other families through their windows, seeing the warm glow of their lives. The silhouettes of people hugging, and the ache in her chest would become a physical weight. The world was celebrating connection, and all she could feel was the profound, deafening silence of her abandonment. She began to believe it was her fault. Her father's rejection and her grandmother's indifference were not just events that happened to her. They were a reflection of who she was. The bullies at school must be right. She was weird. She was a ghost. She deserved the cold shoulder, the whispers, the isolation. She started to scrutinize her own actions, searching for the flaw, the mistake, the essential wrongness that made her unlovable. Her father's words were no longer just a memory. They had become her own inner voice, a constant, critical narrator confirming her worthlessness. If you had seen that little girl huddled in the corner of the schoolyard, what would you have done? One rainy Tuesday, her 9th birthday, the dam of her resilience finally broke. She sat on her bed, listening to the rain lash against the window pane. A rhythm that matched the desolate drumming in her heart. She held a single crayon in her hand, a deep, vibrant blue, but she couldn't bring herself to draw. The emptiness inside her felt bigger than any piece of paper, too vast and colorless to be captured. She was a problem, an obstacle, a piece that didn't fit into the world's puzzle. The pain was no longer sharp. It had settled into a dull, permanent ache of acceptance. She was in the way, and in that moment, she finally believed there was no way out. I cried during this part. Did you feel her pain too? By 14, Sophia had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through the crowded school hallways like a whisper, a ghost in a worn-out coat, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. In Mr. Matthews's art class, she sat in the back, dutifully sketching the assigned bowl of fruit, but keeping her real drawings hidden in a tattered notebook. One afternoon, the final bell was a jarring interruption. In her haste to disappear, the notebook slipped from her bag, falling open beneath her desk. She didn't notice, but Mr. Matthews did. He picked it up, expecting teenage doodles, but instead found a world etched in graphite. He saw a girl with hollow eyes staring from a window, a man's shadow stretching like a scar across a room, a heart held together by stitches. He wasn't looking at a student's sketchbook. He was reading a soul. The next day he asked her to stay after class. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She was sure he would call her grandmother, reporting her for wasting paper on morbid nonsense. He held the open notebook, but his expression wasn't one of anger or concern. It was one of awe. "Sophia," he said, his voice gentle. "Who is this girl?" He pointed to the recurring figure, the lonely sentinel at the window. He didn't ask if she was okay. He asked about her art. He spoke of the power in her lines, the raw emotion in the shadows. He didn't see a troubled child. He saw an artist. For the first time in 6 years, someone looked at her, truly looked, and saw not a burden, but a voice. Have you ever had a moment where one person's words changed how you saw yourself? He closed the notebook and handed it back to her, as if it were a sacred text. Then he placed a long, flat box on the desk between them. Inside, nestled in perfect rows, were charcoal sticks of every thickness, pencils sharpened to lethal points, and a rainbow of oil pastels she had only ever dreamed of. "Real tools for a real artist," he said simply. The weight of them in her hands felt like an anchor and a pair of wings all at once. He then gave her a flyer for a community art workshop held in a converted warehouse downtown. "It's free," he added, sensing her hesitation. "You won't be in the way. You'll be exactly where you belong." The words were a direct antidote to the poison she had carried for so long, a key turning in a lock she didn't know could be opened. Her first steps into the workshop were terrifying. The cavernous space smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and damp clay, a scent of creation that was completely alien to her. It was a beautiful chaos of paint-splattered easels, half-finished sculptures, and people of all ages, their faces smudged with color, their focus absolute. A woman with silver hair and a streak of blue paint on her cheek nodded at her. A young man offered her a spare rag without a word. No one stared. No one whispered. "Here." Her silence wasn't a sign of being broken. It was respected as part of the process. In the quiet, focused energy of that room, Sophia felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation. She felt normal. She felt like she might actually fit. Mr. Matthews had secured her a corner, a small canvas waiting on an easel. For the first time, she wasn't drawing on the back of a bill or a scrap of cardboard. The vast, intimidating white space was hers to claim. She picked up a piece of charcoal, and her fear melted away, replaced by a fierce, urgent need. The small, lonely girl in the window was no longer confined to a tiny square. She emerged onto the canvas, larger, bolder. The shadow of the man walking away became a towering, abstract shape of loss. The colors were dark and visceral, but they were also honest. She wasn't just drawing her pain anymore. She was confronting it, giving it form and substance. Her greatest weakness, her overwhelming sensitivity, was becoming her most formidable strength. Weeks turned into months. The workshop became her sanctuary, her church, her home. The other artists became her silent, supportive family. One evening, Mr. Matthews watched her finish a painting, a raw, powerful piece depicting a small bird with a broken wing, learning to fly inside a cage. He quietly placed a brochure for a prestigious art academy on the table beside her paints. "They offer full scholarships for talent like yours," he said. Sophia stared at the glossy pages. At the images of a life so far removed from her own, it felt like a different planet. But then she looked at her hands, stained with paint, and at the canvas that held her story. A fragile, audacious thought took root. Maybe the world had a place for her after all. Sometimes, all a child needs is someone who says, "I believe in you." The scholarship portfolio became Sophia's entire world. She spent every spare moment at the community workshop, a ghost haunted by ambition, her hands and clothes perpetually dusted with the fine black powder of charcoal. The glossy brochure for the Art Academy was taped to the wall above her small workspace, a portal to a universe she couldn't imagine inhabiting. It was a world of sunlit studios, of confident laughter, of people who had been told their voices mattered from birth. Her application felt less like a submission and more like a desperate message in a bottle, tossed into an ocean of privilege, praying someone on a distant shore would read it and see a survivor, not just a sad story. The fear of rejection was a cold, constant companion. At home, her quiet determination was met with a wall of weary pragmatism. Her grandmother, Helen, saw the growing stack of canvases not as a future, but as a fire hazard. "Art is a game for people with nothing to lose, Sophia," she'd state, her voice flat as she scrubbed potatoes at the sink. "You need a skill, something that pays the bills." Each sentence, though not meant to be cruel, was a small, sharp stone thrown at the fragile house of confidence Sophia was trying to build. Helen's words were a grim echo of her father's logic, reinforcing the deep-seated belief that her passion, the very thing that saved her, was an impractical flaw, a burden on a world that only valued utility. Have you ever had someone you love completely misunderstand your dream? The day of the scholarship interview was a study in alienation. Dressed in her best second-hand clothes, Sophia felt her otherness like a physical cloak the moment she stepped onto the pristine, manicured campus. The interview room was a sterile white box, and the panel of 3 judges regarded her with an unnerving, clinical detachment. They flipped through her portfolio, a collection of her most secret wounds and triumphs. With the dispassionate air of appraisers examining antiques, they spoke a language of formalism and art-historical context that she didn't understand. Then, one of them paused at her most personal piece, The Girl in the Window. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "A bit melodramatic, don't you think? Adolescent angst is a well-trodden path." The words weren't a critique, they were a dismissal. She walked out of that white room feeling flayed, her soul exposed and then casually discarded. The interviewer's verdict, melodramatic, well-trodden path, played on a merciless loop in her head, weaving itself into her father's parting words. "You'll just be in the way." Of course, her pain wasn't a unique testament to survival. It was a cliché. Her art wasn't a powerful voice. It was the self-indulgent scribbling of a sad teenager. The fragile hope that Mr. Matthews had so carefully nurtured began to crumble into dust. The world she had dared to knock on the door of had just slammed it shut, confirming her deepest fear. She had nothing of value to offer. She was just taking up space, wasting their time with her common, uninteresting sorrow. For a week she didn't paint. The art supplies sat in their box, a silent accusation. She retreated into the familiar, comforting greyness of her grandmother's apartment, a world that demanded nothing of her soul. She scrubbed floors, folded laundry, and disappeared back into the role of the quiet, helpful girl. The silence was a heavy blanket she pulled over her head, blocking out the light. If she stopped wanting, she couldn't be disappointed. If she made herself invisible again, no one could judge her. It was easier to be a ghost than a failed artist. It was safer to be a burden you could ignore than a voice you could dismiss. Have you ever thought of giving up, just because it felt safer than trying? Mr. Matthews found her sitting in the dim living room, the afternoon light struggling to get through the grimy window. He didn't offer easy platitudes or tell her she was brilliant. He just sat, a quiet presence in the gloom, and asked her to tell him what happened. As she recounted the interview, her voice barely a whisper, he listened with an intensity that made her feel seen. When she finished, he didn't say the interviewers were wrong. He said something far more important. They looked at your map of hell and complained about the draftsmanship, Sophia. They saw the what, but they didn't have the courage to see the why. Your art isn't angst. It's evidence. It's the proof that you are still here. Don't you dare let them convince you it's worthless. But his words couldn't completely silence the old ghosts. That night, a rejection letter arrived in the mail, its crisp official language, a final nail in the coffin of her dream. The pain was so sharp and familiar, it felt like a homecoming. She pulled out the one crumpled drawing she had kept from her childhood, the one of her and her father. A wave of grief, raw and absolute eyes washed over her. In that moment of profound defeat, she missed him. She missed the man who had shattered her world. She missed the fantasy of a father who might have been proud, the temptation to tear up the letter, the drawing, the entire portfolio, was a physical force, a yearning to destroy all the evidence of her foolish, hopeful heart. She sat on the floor, the rejection letter in one hand, the crayon drawing in the other. They felt like the same verdict, delivered 10 years apart. You are not wanted. You are in the way. Tears fell onto the faded paper, blurring the smiling face of the little girl who hadn't yet learned she was a problem. For a long moment, she let herself be that 8-year-old again, abandoned and powerless. But then, something shifted deep within her. She looked down at her own hands, no longer small and helpless, but strong, calloused, and stained with the very colors of her pain. She had fallen, but something inside of her refused to let her stay on the ground. Slowly, deliberately, Sophia stood up. She walked to her small desk and pinned the rejection letter to the wall. It was no longer a verdict. It was a declaration of war. She took out a fresh canvas, larger than any she had dared to use before. The pain from the letter, the interview, and her father's memory didn't vanish. It sharpened. It became fuel. It became a new, darker shade of blue, a more defiant red. She picked up a thick stick of charcoal, and her hand did not tremble. She began to draw not the girl trapped behind the glass, but the moment the glass shatters. She wouldn't have their scholarship. She would never have their approval, but they would not have her silence. She would build her own world, one masterpiece at a time. 10 years later, the air in the gallery was electric. It smelled of fresh paint, champagne, and success. A universe away from the stale scent of cardboard and abandonment. Sophia, now 28, moved through the space with the quiet authority of a creator in her own kingdom. The ghost girl was gone, replaced by a woman whose gaze was direct and whose presence commanded the room. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that had learned to hold its own strength. The whispers that followed her were not of pity, but of awe. This was her first solo exhibition. Each canvas lining the stark white walls was a testament, a survivor's map. She was no longer a piece that didn't fit. She was the architect of the entire puzzle. A man slipped through the grand entrance, a shadow in the bright, warm celebratory light. He was older than his years, his suit ill-fitting and worn, his shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. He moved with the hesitant shuffle of someone who knew he didn't belong. Sophia saw him from across the room, and the rhythmic beat of her heart faltered for a single, cold second. It was him, Richard, a ghost from a buried life, stepping into her masterpiece. He didn't see her. His eyes, clouded with a decade of failure and regret, scanned the crowd with a lost, searching quality. He was a relic, out of place and out of time, an artifact of a past she had painstakingly painted over. He wandered aimlessly, his gaze drifting over the canvases with a detached curiosity, until he stopped dead in front of the exhibition's centerpiece. It was a massive, 5-foot-tall painting titled Foundations. It depicted a small girl with cavernous eyes, sitting on a worn rug surrounded by half-packed boxes. A single, broken crayon lay near her foot. For Richard, it wasn't a painting. It was a memory exhumed, a perfectly preserved crime scene. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. The gallery's polite hum faded into a roaring in his ears. The self-deception he had carefully constructed for 10 years, that he had left for her future, that it was a noble sacrifice. crumbled into dust under the weight of his daughter's unforgiving graphite and oil. His eyes darted from the painting to the small plaque beside it. Sophia Helen Marks. The name was a blow. He scanned the room, a frantic desperation dawning on his face, until his gaze finally locked onto hers. He saw the woman across the room, the one everyone was watching, the one whose name was on the wall. The little girl he had deemed an obstacle had not just survived. She had built an empire from the very pain he had inflicted. The realization was a physical shock, a violent recalibration of his reality. He hadn't just misjudged her, he had failed to see her at all. The hindrance he had cast aside was the most extraordinary thing he had ever been a part of. Recognized her too late, didn't he? Sophia walked toward him. Her steps were not rushed or angry. They were the deliberate, measured steps of a queen crossing her own court. The space between them shrank, each footfall a drumbeat marking the passage of 3,750 days of silence. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, seemed to part for her. She stopped a few feet from him, her expression a calm, fat, unreadable mask. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The paintings spoke for her. They screamed for her. She simply stood there, the living embodiment of his greatest mistake, and let him drown in the silence he had created. This was not a confrontation. It was a reckoning, and for the first time, she was the one holding all the power. His facade of a man holding it together shattered. The architect who built skyscrapers was reduced to a trembling old man. He saw the degenerative tremors in his own hands, the cruel irony of a creator who could no longer create. And then he looked at hers, steady and stained with the faint hues of her work. He had come here to find her, a last desperate resort to ask for financial help, but the words were ash in his mouth. How could he ask for $1 when he was standing in a temple, built from the wealth of a soul he had tried to bankrupt? Sophia, he whispered, the name a fragile, broken thing. He looked from her face to the art, and he saw it all, his shadow walking away, the lonely window, the fractured heart. She didn't flinch. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not the whisper he remembered. It was calm, clear, and carried the resonant weight of her success. "You're looking at my life's work," she said, gesturing to the room. "Every canvas. You were my first real subject, you know. You taught me everything I needed to know about light and shadow, mostly shadow." The words were delivered without malice, a simple, devastating statement of fact. She was not the victim in this story anymore. She was the narrator, and she had just written him into his final, tragic chapter. The power had not just shifted. It had been reclaimed, reforged, and now belonged entirely to her. Richard finally understood the full scope of his failure. It wasn't the failed project overseas, or the money he'd lost. His true bankruptcy had occurred 10 years ago, in a small apartment with a single, brutal sentence. He saw the little girl offering him a drawing of a fantastic building, her heart held out as a gift, and he saw himself a coward, turning his back on a future far grander than any he could ever design. The regret was a physical sickness, a hollowing out of his very being. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to beg for a forgiveness he knew he had no right to ask for. But what words could possibly mend a wound this deep, this beautifully and brutally documented? Sophia watched the man who was her father unravel before her. The world around them buzzed with the life she had built, a life he had no part in. The little girl who had cried herself to sleep in a cold bed was still inside her, but she no longer made the decisions. The artist did. Forgiveness was not an obligation. It was a choice. She could destroy him with a word, or she could offer a grace he did not deserve. The silence stretched, and in that moment, she held his entire world in the palm of her hand, the same hand that once held a broken crayon. Would you forgive in this situation? Sophia looked at the broken man before her, the architect of her pain, and felt not rage but a profound and quiet finality. The little girl inside her who craved his approval was silent now, her ghost laid to rest on canvas after canvas. In his place stood a subject, a shadow she had finally learned to paint in full light. She walked to her desk in the gallery's back office, wrote a check for an amount that was both generous and impersonal, and returned. She handed it to him not as a daughter, but as a philanthropist might to a stranger. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a transaction that settled a debt he could never truly repay. It was severance. It was her freedom. purchased and paid for with her own success. What would you do if your past came asking for a handout? Richard took the check, his trembling hands barely able to hold the crisp paper that represented both his salvation and his ultimate humiliation. He didn't say thank you, the words were impossible. He simply nodded, a slow, defeated gesture, and turned. As he walked away, his silhouette shrank against the bright gallery lights, a mirror image of the man who had walked out of her life 10 years ago. But this time, he was the one leaving with nothing, while she remained, surrounded by the vibrant, powerful world she had built from the rubble he'd left behind. He faded back into the city, a ghost haunted not by a lost wife, but by the living, breathing masterpiece of a daughter he had thrown away. He was now, finally, the one who was in the way. The exhibition was a resounding success, selling out on the opening night, but the money was never the point. Sophia used the profits to buy the old, struggling community workshop, the very sanctuary that had saved her. She established the Matthews Foundation, named after the teacher who first saw her, creating a permanent, free haven for children who felt like ghosts in their own lives. It was a place where wasted paper was a canvas, and sensitivity wasn't a burden, but a superpower. She was taking the darkest material of her life, the neglect, the loneliness, the feeling of worthlessness, and using it as the foundation for a home where no child would ever have to draw their dreams in secret again. Have you ever wished you could build a safe place for someone? She often visited the workshop, not as a patron but as a fellow artist. She'd walk through the beautiful chaos of paint and clay, the air thick with the smell of creation. One afternoon, she saw a young girl huddled in a corner, sketching furiously on a scrap of cardboard, her eyes holding a familiar, guarded pain. Sophia approached quietly, not with pity, but with the silent understanding of a shared language. She placed a brand new box of professional-grade pastels beside the girl. The child looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Sophia simply smiled. "Real tools for a real artist," she whispered, the words a sacred echo. She wasn't just funding a building. She was passing the torch, ensuring the light would never go out for another child lost in the dark. Years later, Sophia stood in her own sunlit studio, a vast, open space that was the complete antithesis of her grandmother's cramped apartment. On one clean white wall, in a simple frame, was the small, crumpled drawing of a girl, a father, and a fantastical building. It was no longer a symbol of rejection, but a relic of her origin story, the first brick in the empire of her soul. She was often alone, but never lonely. Her silence was no longer a shield against the world. It was a space for creation, a peaceful kingdom of her own design. She had learned that a home isn't 4 walls someone gives you, but the space you build inside yourself where you are unconditionally welcome. She was rejected by the one who should have loved her, but she was embraced by the world. Her art hung in galleries on different continents, her story speaking to thousands of souls who had also felt invisible. She had taken her father's cruel verdict, "You'll just be in the way," and transformed it into her life's purpose, to stand in the way of despair, to block the path of loneliness for others, to be a beautiful, unmovable obstacle in the face of anyone who dared to tell a child they didn't matter. Her life became her greatest masterpiece, a testament that the deepest wounds can become the most powerful sources of light. Her story wasn't about the father who left. It was about the world she built after he was gone. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more powerful journeys of the human spirit. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their story isn't over.